Good day, viewers. I am George Orwell, or as I was known in another life, Eric Arthur Blair. Today I invite you to step into my world, a journey through the lens of a writer who dared to challenge the status quo, who peered into the abyss of totalitarianism and the distortion of truth. If you've ever wondered about the man behind Animal Farm and 1984, or pondered the complexities of freedom and control, you've come to the right place. Join me as we traverse the backstreets of London, the battlefields of the Spanish Civil War, the corridors of the BBC, and the solitary beauty of the Scottish Isle of Jura. Together, we'll explore the inspiration behind my works, the struggles of my personal life, and the relentless pursuit of a society rooted in fairness and truth. So if you're prepared to delve into a narrative that's as relevant today as it was in the mid-20th century, I urge you, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join our discussion. Your engagement is not merely an interaction, it's a stand for critical thinking and liberty in a world where Big Brother is always watching. Welcome to the world of George Orwell. I was born on June 25, 1903, in Motihari, Bengal, India, a jewel in the crown of the vast British Empire. My story starts. My father, Richard Wormsley Blair, ventured to India at 18, working in the civil service as an opium agent. This was a lucrative business for Britain, mainly exporting to China. My mother, Ida Mabel Limousin, only 21 when she married, was born in Surrey to a French father and an English mother. She grew up in Moulmein, Burma, in a well-established merchant family. My childhood, though not prosperous, was steeped in a sense of British privilege. At 1, I moved to England with my mother and sister, while my father stayed behind in India. As a child, I was sickly, often struggling with lung-related illnesses, a battle that continued throughout my life. We settled in Henley-on-Thames, Oxfordshire, in late 1905. Despite being a solitary child, I fondly remember my childhood, especially being close to my mother. My relationship with my father was distant, as we hardly saw each other until his retirement in 1912. That year, I vividly remember the sinking of the RMS Titanic, a stark reminder of the fragility of life. Just 2 years later, World War I shattered the peaceful England of my childhood. From an early age, I was an avid reader and writer. In 1911, I started at St. Cyprian's School in Sussex, a stepping stone to public school. I excelled academically, particularly in cricket. By then, my father had retired and we moved to Shiplake near Henley. There, I formed a close friendship with the Buddicombe children, sharing my love for literature with Jacinta. At 11, I dreamt of becoming a famous author, inspired by Shakespeare. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 was a defining moment. I remember writing a patriotic poem, urging young men to enlist, which was published in the local paper and read at my school assembly. However, my memories of St. Cyprian's aren't all fond. In a later essay, I described harsh beatings, poor living conditions, and a bias towards wealthier students. Despite these challenges, I won school prizes in English and classics, a testament to my love for literature and learning. In 1916, my journey as a scholar took a turn when I won a classics scholarship to Wellington College, and soon after, I placed 13th in the Eton examination. There were only 12 scholarships, so I had to wait for a vacancy. A term at Wellington later, and I found myself at Eton, a bastion of British education and elite upbringing. But at Eton, I felt like an outsider. Although I was a King's Scholar, exempt from fees and part of an intellectual elite, I never quite fit in with the majority of the students. Eton was a different world for me compared to St. Cyprian's. Here, I let my guard down academically. Despite being a classics scholar, my performance in Latin was poor and I shifted to less demanding studies. University dreams at Oxford or Cambridge started to fade away. The Great War, raging since 1914, cast a long shadow over these years. My father, at 60, enlisted as a second lieutenant and went to France. while my mother worked in London's Ministry of Pensions. As for me, I continued to confide my literary dreams to Jacintha Buddicom, particularly influenced by G.K. Masterton, H.G. Wells, and D.H. Lawrence. Even my poems for Jacintha bordered on romantic. As 1920 approached, discussions about my future began. My mother hoped I'd go to university, but my father insisted on the Imperial Civil Service. My academic record at Eton didn't help, and eventually my father's view prevailed. After leaving Eton in 1921, I moved to Southwold, Suffolk, where my parents retired. Then, in June 1922, just after my 19th birthday, I passed the entrance exam for the Indian Imperial Police. I chose Burma, connected to my mother's childhood and where my maternal grandmother still lived. Arriving in Burma, I was entering a world recently annexed by the British Empire. The British had dismantled Burmese political institutions, and the country was under military rule. As a new member of the police force, I found Burma challenging: rampant crime, a harsh climate, and dangers like wild animal attacks. It was here, in this complex and often hostile environment, that my understanding of imperialism, justice, and my own place in the world began to take shape. In January 1924, after completing my police training, I was assigned to Myanmar in the Irrawaddy River Delta, about 100 miles from Yangon. As an assistant to the district superintendent, I managed a police station of 20 to 30 people. That year, I moved to Twante, still a good distance from Yangon. Here, I oversaw the police station and gathered intelligence in local villages. By the year's end, I was promoted and posted to Syriam, tasked with protecting the operations of the Burma Oil Company refinery. Syriam was a relief, a place where I could indulge in some Western comforts. In April 1926, I was transferred to Moulmein, which allowed me to meet my grandmother and aunt. However, by the end of 1927, after being moved to Qatar and contracting dengue fever, I returned to England on medical leave. I would never return to Burma, but the impact of those 4.5 years was profound. I saw the brutality of British imperialism and was equally shocked by some of the native Burmese practices, which Europeans of the time deemed backward. Back in England, during a family holiday in Cornwall, I announced my resignation from the Burma police to pursue writing. This decision caused a rift with my parents, especially my father. Seeking guidance, I visited an old tutor at Eton who advised moving to London, where writers and editors congregated. So I found lodgings on Portobello Road and began exploring the working-class areas of London, gathering material for my future writings. In early 1928, drawn by literary ambitions, I moved to Paris. Here I wrote short pieces for literary magazines and articles on British censorship and working-class conditions. My first year in Paris, living among writers and artists in the Bohemian Latin Quarter, was vibrant. A bout of influenza and subsequent destitution led me to work as a dishwasher with a Russian friend, an experience that deeply influenced my first novel, Down and Out in Paris and London. Returning to Southwold in December 1929, I continued writing. The Spike, an article about my tramping experiences in London, was accepted by the Adelphi magazine, but it took 2 years to get published. I became close friends with the magazine's editors, Sir Richard Rees and Max Plowman. Despite my strained relationship with my father and Southwold's upper-class reputation, I spent the next 5 years there, writing from my bedroom and occasionally shocking my family with my unorthodox lifestyle. While in France, I didn't just write about my experiences, I also worked as a book reviewer for the Adelphi. By 1931, I had become a regular contributor. To supplement my income, I tutored children and even went tramping in London. One time, I found myself working as a cleaner in Limehouse, where my posh accent amused the family's children. In September 1931, I spent a few weeks in Kent's Hopfields, a summer break for East London workers. I kept a detailed diary of this journey, where survival often meant resorting to stealing supplies and food. Despite my attempt to blend in with a Cockney accent, My natural way of speaking sometimes slipped through, ironically earning me more sympathy from my companions who thought I had fallen from grace. After laboring for over 10 hours a day for 15 days, my hopfield work netted me a mere 16 shillings, barely covering the train fares. Back in London, I worked at the Billingsgate Fish Market and wrote up my hop-picking diary. The appalling conditions at my lodgings in Tooley Street forced me to ask my parents for money, leading to a move to the more respectable Harrow Road in West London. In early 1932, I engaged Leonard Moore as my literary agent. I was working on getting A Scullion's Diary published, a manuscript based on my Paris experiences. T.S. Eliot at Faber and Faber found it too short, but interesting. Around the same time, I took a job as a teacher at Hawthorne's High School in Hayes, a place I found dreary. Finally, in June, I got the news from Moore that Victor Gollins was willing to publish A Scullion's Diary for a $40 advance. After revisions, it was published in January 1933 as Down and Out in Paris and London under the pseudonym George Orwell, a name I chose for its strong English connotations, with George from St. George and Orwell from the River Orwell in Suffolk. Despite favourable reviews and a spot on the Sunday Express bestseller list, my life remained precarious. My writing was seen as intelligent but somewhat old-fashioned, and I struggled with happiness, even briefly seeking solace in religion. Teaching was not my passion, yet it was necessary for survival. In 1933, I moved to Frayse College in Uxbridge to teach French. My personal life was no less tumultuous. In 1930, I proposed to Brenda Salkeld, who preferred to remain friends. A year later, I was involved with Eleanor Jakes, but she was entangled with my friend Dennis Collings and married him in 1934. My journey, both as a writer and in my personal life, was filled with ups and downs, a path that shaped the person I became. In January 1933, I sent Leonard Moore 100 pages of Burmese Days, a novel inspired by my experiences in Burma. By November, the complete manuscript was ready. However, after a serious bout with pneumonia in December, I returned to Southwold to recover. There I learned that Gollins had rejected Burmese Days, fearing libel. But my American publisher Harper Brothers took a chance on it, and it was published in the United States in October 1934. Burmese Days is set in the fictional Kyoktala, mirroring Kata, my last Burmese posting. Its protagonist, John Flory, a teak merchant, finds himself disillusioned with the European community, drawn instead to an Indian doctor. Flory's life becomes complicated when he falls for Elizabeth Lackerstein, the niece of a timber firm manager, and dismisses his Burmese mistress. The novel explores themes of love, betrayal, and the racial tensions in colonial Burma, ending in tragedy for Flory. While waiting for Burmese Days to be published, I penned A Clergyman's Daughter in 6 months. The story follows Dorothy Hare, a rector's daughter from Suffolk, through a series of misfortunes, from a mental breakdown to life among tramps in Kent, and finally to a private school in West London. The novel was a reflection of my own experiences and observations of rural Suffolk and the London poor, though I later grew to dislike it and refused its reprinting during my lifetime. In late October, thanks to my Aunt Nellie, I got a part-time job at Book Lovers Corner, a Hampstead bookshop. This allowed me to live in London and still have time for writing. During my 15 months there, I worked on Keep the Aspidistra Flying, a novel about a poet's struggle for recognition in a closed literary elite. The story, though fictional, mirrored my own journey as a writer, even as I was gradually becoming part of the London literary scene. During my time at Book Lovers Corner, I was deeply influenced by the left-wing politics of the Westrops, devoted members of the Independent Labour Party. My anti-imperialist sentiments and a growing sense of fairness were slowly guiding me towards socialism. These years were also filled with extensive discussions with my publisher Gollins, particularly about A Clergyman's Daughter, which was eventually published in March 1935. The novel received mixed reviews, appreciated for its specific scenes, but criticized for style and plot. Following a thorough vetting to avoid libel issues, Burmese Days was published in the UK in late June 1935. Cyril Connolly, an old friend from St Cyprian's and Eton, reviewed it positively in the New Statesman, rekindling our friendship after 13 years. In the spring of 1935, I met Eileen O'Shaughnessy, a psychology student at University College London. I was immediately taken with her and our relationship progressed quickly, although she wanted to complete her studies before making any commitments. While working on Keep the Aspidistra Flying, I became a regular book reviewer for the New English Weekly. In January 1936, after submitting the manuscript, my publisher suggested a trip to northern England to document the social conditions there, so I embarked on a journey with no specific destination, eventually reaching Manchester. I travelled through Wigan, Liverpool, Sheffield, Leeds and Barnsley, keeping a detailed diary of my encounters with the working class in docks and mines, shocked by the poverty I witnessed. In Barnsley, I attended a meeting by Sir Oswald Mosley, leader of the British Union of Fascists. Mosley's ability to sway his audience was deeply concerning, especially against the backdrop of rising fascism in Europe, marked by the ascent of Hitler in Germany. Returning to London in late March, I moved to a small cottage in Wallington, Hertfordshire on April 2nd. This cottage would become my retreat for over a decade, a haven away from the bustle of London, where I could write, think and reflect on the rapidly changing world around me. When I received news of the publication of Keep the Aspidistra Flying, I was already deeply immersed in transforming my Northern England diary into what would become The Road to Wigan Pier. It's unclear if Eileen was living with me in Wallington at the time, but on June 9th, 1936, we married in the local village church. Although George Orwell was just my pen name, Eileen became Eileen Blair. As I was still known by my birth name in personal circles, Eileen had left her degree behind, possibly expecting to be involved in my work, but she found herself largely on the periphery. By the end of the year, I completed The Road to Wigan Pier, sending it to Gollancz on December 15th. The book was a combination of documentary reporting on Northern England's living conditions and an essay on my political beliefs and socialism. It was published in March 1937 after some initial hesitations. The Spanish Civil War, which had begun in July 1936, captured my attention. The Republican government was facing a military revolt led by General Francisco Franco, and soon the conflict escalated, drawing support from both fascist and communist powers. In late 1936, I decided to go to Spain, arriving in Barcelona at the end of December. My goal was not only to report on the situation, but also to support the Republican cause and fight against fascism. I joined a militia unit of the United Workers' Marxist Party through my connections in the Independent Labour Party. In early January 1937, we were sent to the Aragon front, but mostly engaged in patrol duty due to a lack of supplies. While I showed courage under fire, I often spent my off-duty time in solitude, reading and writing. In March, Eileen joined me in Spain, taking up a support role in the background. Later, my unit joined the Republican army besieging Huesca. One intense moment came when my company captured an enemy redoubt, only to face a counter-attack. I managed to suppress enemy fire with a bomb, allowing us and our comrades time to retreat. By late April, I was back in Barcelona, looking to transfer to the Madrid front, which required joining the Communist International Brigade. Before I could transfer to the Madrid front, Barcelona erupted in conflict. The Civil Guard, seeking control of the city for the Republican government now under Soviet sway, clashed with the workers' militias. After 3 days of turmoil, barricaded on a rooftop observatory, I witnessed the government troops disbanding the militias on May 6th. Opting to return to the Aragon front, a sniper's bullet through my throat on May 20th abruptly ended my time in combat. After a series of hospital stays, I was declared unfit for service and received discharge papers. Returning to Barcelona on June 21st, Eileen and I found ourselves in a precarious situation due to the government's crackdown on the United Workers' Marxist Party. We narrowly escaped Spain thanks to the British consulate's assistance with our passports. My 6 months in Spain profoundly altered my political perspective, heavily influencing my subsequent book reviews and articles. It also cemented my anti-communist and anti-Stalinist views. Back in England, an article I wrote about the Barcelona events was rejected by the New Statesman, as any criticism of the Republican government was deemed pro-Franco. I spent the latter half of 1937 in Wellington chronicling my Spanish experiences in what would become Homage to Catalonia. By autumn, it was clear that Franco's advance was inexorable. Homage to Catalonia, published in April 1938, received some positive reviews but was a commercial failure, selling under 700 copies by year's end. Meanwhile, I struggled with severe lung issues, spending over 5 months at Preston Hall Sanatorium in Kent. During this period, I joined the Independent Labour Party, distancing myself from the communists and mainstream Labour. In September, Aileen and I travelled to Morocco in hopes of improving my health. However, I grew restless there, yearning for England. During this time, I wrote Coming Up for Air. The novel, reflecting on the changes wrought by modernity and commercialism, follows George Bowling's disillusioned return to his hometown in Oxfordshire, only to find it transformed beyond recognition. Upon my return to England on March 30th, 1939, I promptly delivered the manuscript of Coming Up for Air to Leonard Moore. The book, published by Gollins in June, was a success, in stark contrast to Homage to Catalonia, selling out its first edition of 2,000 copies. By the end of June, I found myself in Southwold, by my father's deathbed. After his passing, I returned to Wellington, maintaining a diary that chronicled the international tensions leading to the Second World War in September 1939. During this period of escalating conflict, Aileen secured a position in the government's censorship department in London. I had hoped to join her there, but instead, I remained in Wellington for the next 9 months. Initially opposed to the war, the outbreak in September changed my perspective. Driven by a sense of patriotic duty, I sought ways to contribute to the war effort despite my ongoing health struggles. Like many writers, I questioned the relevance of my work in wartime, but without a more direct role in the conflict, I continued to write, completing Inside the Whale, a collection of essays published by Gollins in March 1940. A new opportunity for my work arose with the launch of Horizon, a monthly literary magazine edited by Cyril Connolly, which started on New Year's Day 1940. By May, Aileen and I had moved to a new flat near Regent's Park in London, where we closely followed the war's progression, including the evacuation of Dunkirk and France's surrender on June 17th. The fall of France brought personal grief as well, with the news of Aileen's brother Lawrence's death while serving with the British Expeditionary Force. The threat of a German invasion led to the creation of the local defence volunteers, later known as the Home Guard. I joined a company in St John's Wood, quickly rising to the rank of sergeant. Our duties included guarding local strategic points and meeting twice weekly for drills. In addition to my Home Guard responsibilities, I collaborated on a project initiated by Fred Warburg to unite writers in addressing wartime issues. My contribution was to write about the possibility of a democratic socialist Britain. The Lion and the Unicorn, written amidst the London Blitz, begins by exploring the essence of Englishness. In The Lion and the Unicorn, I posited that Dunkirk's failure was a failure of capitalism, arguing that only a socialist government backed by the people and workers could win the war and effectively defend democracy. In 1941, I started writing a regular London letter for the American journal Partisan Review, which became a platform for my thoughts on the home front and my aspirations for post-war Britain's social and economic transformation. I staunchly defended the Home Guard, appreciating the influx of younger working-class volunteers eager for military experience. Despite the German bombing of London, I noticed a certain detachment among Londoners by 1941, perhaps because a German invasion seemed unlikely after the Royal Air Force's success in the Battle of Britain. However, news of setbacks in Greece, North Africa, and the Middle East weighed heavily on me, and I remained skeptical about the Soviet Union's prospects after Hitler's invasion on June 22nd, suspecting that the Germans would not have risked it unless they were confident of a quick victory. In August 1941, after a year of job searching, I joined the BBC's Indian section as a radio producer. This role involved preparing news commentaries and summaries, both in English and translated into local languages, alongside political and cultural programs. I was keen to highlight Indian writers, providing them a wider platform. Balancing the delicate political climate with India's burgeoning nationalist movements was challenging, and I often found myself frustrated with external interference. In March 1942, resuming my diary after a break, I questioned the impact of my work at the BBC, unaware that my broadcasts were a crucial connection for those under Japanese occupation. My focus on Indian affairs during this period also influenced my literary work. This was evident in a 1942 essay for Horizon on Rudyard Kipling, where I grappled with the complexities of empire, acknowledging the exploitation of India while admiring the men of action who built it. My interest in India's future intensified as I followed Sir Stafford Cripps' mission there in March 1942. Cripps, the newly appointed leader of the House of Commons, proposed self-government for India post-war in exchange for support during the war. However, the mission failed, as his terms were unacceptable to both the British government and Indian nationalists. I admired Cripps for his principles, and he was seen by many, including myself, as a potential challenger to Churchill for the leadership of a more radical wartime government. As 1942 progressed, the war's tide began to turn. The German advance stalled at Stalingrad, and the British gained an advantage in North Africa. Despite these shifts, I grew increasingly disillusioned with my work at the BBC, leading to my resignation in September 1943. I then joined the Tribune as a literary editor, a left-wing weekly newspaper financially backed by Stafford Cripps. At the Tribune, my journalism, often critical of the Soviet Union, caused some stir among readers, but I was supported by editor Aneurin Bevan. I also wrote a column titled As I Please, discussing everything from war thoughts to the roses at my Wallington cottage. Alongside this, I continued to write for the Partisan Review, Horizon, and The Observer. During 1943, I worked on a new novel, Animal Farm, an allegory warning of the dangers of totalitarianism, set on a farm where animals overthrow their human masters. By February 1944, the manuscript was ready, but I anticipated difficulties finding a publisher due to the ERA's sympathetic view of Stalin and the Soviet Union. After unsuccessfully approaching Gollancz, I turned to Jonathan Cape, who initially seemed interested in publishing Animal Farm. However, by June, Cape, having consulted with the Ministry of Information, decided against publishing a book that could offend the Soviets, leaving me in search of a publisher willing to take on this contentious but vital work. In July 1944, after some hesitation, I reached out to Fred Warburg about publishing Animal Farm. Despite the wartime paper shortage, Warburg's firm agreed to publish it if they could acquire the necessary paper. By September, they confirmed a 1945 release, though the book wouldn't be published until August of that year. During this time, Eileen and I, married for 8 years and unable to have children, decided to adopt. We chose a boy born on May 14, 1944, from Newcastle, where Eileen's sister-in-law worked with unmarried mothers. We named him Richard Horatio Blair. Following the bombing of our flat in June, we finally settled into a new home in Islington by October and brought Richard down from Newcastle. Eileen left her Ministry of Food job in 1942 to care for Richard full-time. In early 1945, I took a war correspondent role for The Observer and the Manchester Evening News, leaving for Paris, while Eileen and Richard stayed at Greystone. However, during a legal trip to London for Richard's adoption, Eileen fell ill. A medical examination revealed several uterine tumors, leading to a scheduled hysterectomy on March 29th. Tragically, she died from cardiac failure under anesthesia at just 39. Reeling from the news of Eileen's death while in Paris, I returned to England immediately. Despite my grief, I resumed my duties as a war correspondent covering the Allied advance into Germany and the aftermath of the German surrender on May 8th. By June's end, I had arranged care for Richard and brought him back to our Islington flat. The publication of Animal Farm in August was a resounding success, establishing me as a prominent writer. The novel, succinct yet profound, depicts the animals of a mismanaged farm overthrowing their human farmer. Led by the pigs Snowball and Napoleon, the animals initially see improvements. However, following a power struggle, Napoleon expels Snowball and, with Squealer's help, convinces the animals of Snowball's betrayal. Gradually, the pigs become indistinguishable from humans, and the farm's initial promise of equality erodes into a harsh, authoritarian regime. Animal Farm was my vehement critique of Stalin's dictatorial reign, a stark portrayal of his manipulation of reality and the creation of an elite reminiscent of the old Russian aristocracy, betraying the core principles of socialism. The characters of Napoleon and Snowball represent Stalin and his rival Leon Trotsky. Despite Trotsky's prominence post-1917 revolution and expectations of his leadership after Lenin's death, he was outmaneuvered and exiled by Stalin, eventually assassinated by a Stalinist agent in 1940. The success of Animal Farm brought concerns that it might be misconstrued as a critique of socialism rather than Stalinism. A staunch socialist myself, I was pleased with the election of Clement Attlee's Labour government in July 1945, but remained hopeful for more radical changes. Meanwhile, Eileen's death had left a void, and her last letter pointing out my overwork spurred thoughts of relocating to the countryside to focus on novel writing. By September 1945, plans were underway to move to the Scottish island of Jura, renting Barn Hill farmhouse, though I stayed in London while it underwent renovations. Despite establishing a routine with Richard and our housekeeper nurse Susan Watson in Islington, my health was failing, and I felt a deep loneliness. This led to several marriage proposals to younger women, all of whom declined. Plans to move to Jura were delayed by a tubercular hemorrhage in late February and my sister Marjorie's death. I finally relocated at the end of May 1946, joined by my sister Avril, Richard and Susan. The remoteness of Barn Hill, 7 miles from the nearest village, required purchasing a motorbike for essential trips. This isolation provided the peace needed for writing, yet it also made staying in touch with friends in London challenging. Inviting visitors to Jura proved daunting, as the journey involved an arduous mix of trains, buses, boats and possibly a taxing walk, depending on the weather and road conditions. Despite my initial optimism of completing my latest novel by early autumn, the distractions and demands of life on Jura impeded my progress. In the 1930s and 40s, I closely observed the rise of totalitarian regimes in Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union. The war years, with their heightened government control and censorship in Britain, furthered my concern about the misuse of language to distort truth. I saw totalitarianism's roots in this manipulation and feared humanity's susceptibility to it. My upcoming novel was a stark warning against these dangers, driven by a sense of urgency as my health waned. By September, I had completed about 50 pages of the novel. I took a brief return to London to reconnect with friends and handle professional matters. In January 1947, a BBC radio adaptation of Animal Farm was broadcast, and I shifted my publishing allegiance to Secker and Warburg, having convinced Victor Gollancz to release me from our contract. Back at Barn Hill by April, my goal was to finish the novel by early 1948. However, recurring health issues hampered my efforts. Susan Watson, initially helping with my care, left Barn Hill after a disagreement with my sister Avril. Thankfully, Richard Rees dedicated much of his time to assist me. As the year progressed, my health deteriorated, making a planned trip to London impossible. Diagnosed with tuberculosis, I spent Christmas in a Glasgow hospital. Despite some improvement in the spring, I defied medical advice to rest and returned to Jura to work on the second draft. By October, the manuscript, now titled 1984, was ready for typing. Struggling to find a typist willing to travel to remote Jura, I undertook the task myself despite my worsening condition. I left Jura for the last time in early 1949, seeking treatment at a sanatorium in the Cotswolds. Fred Warburg, upon reading the manuscript, was shocked, interpreting it as a satirical attack on the Soviet Union and worrying about its potential misuse as anti-Soviet propaganda. However, 1984 is set in a dystopian version of wartime England, renamed Airstrip 1 in the novel, part of the superstate Oceania. It depicts a society under the omnipresent surveillance of Big Brother, with posters and two-way televisions monitoring the populace. Winston Smith, the protagonist, works at the Ministry of Truth, tasked with rewriting history to fit the party's narrative. This novel was not just a critique of totalitarian regimes, but a warning about the fragility of truth and freedom in any society. After publishing 1984 in June, with 25,000 copies released and positive reviews, my spirits lifted briefly despite my deteriorating health. In September, I moved to University College Hospital, ironically near the Senate House, the inspiration for the Ministry of Truth. Clinging to hope, I proposed to Sonia Brownell, who worked with Cyril Connolly at Horizon, and we married on October 13th in the hospital. Sadly, my health continued to decline. Plans were made for a journey to Switzerland, not in hope of recovery, but for a more peaceful end. However, I passed away on January 21, 1950, before the trip could take place. From Eric Blair, the prospective civil servant of the British Empire, to George Orwell, the acclaimed novelist, my life was a journey of shedding privilege and embracing a form of independent anti-Soviet socialism. My experiences in Spain, work at the BBC, and observations of totalitarianism shaped my literary masterpieces, Animal Farm and 1984. However, the success of these novels coincided with personal tragedy and failing health. My critiques, often seen as attacks on the Soviet Union, were misunderstood as rejections of socialism itself, despite my leftist stance. My works, especially 1984, continue to spark debate about authoritarianism and its effects on society and freedom. Thank you for joining me on this enlightening journey through my life and works. We've traversed through the shadows of totalitarian regimes, the nuances of societal truths, and the enduring power of the human spirit. I hope this exploration has ignited a spark of thought, a question, or perhaps a revelation in your mind. As we part ways, I encourage you to leave your mark on this journey. Your comments are not just words. They are the voice of freedom, the dialogue of the curious, the resistance against the silence of oppression. Share your thoughts, your insights, or even your disagreements. Let us keep the conversation alive in the spirit of open discourse and critical examination. And before you depart, remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. In doing so, you're not just supporting this platform, you're championing the cause of free thought and expression in a world that often seeks to stifle it.